So first off, I want to welcome everybody. We're going to focus on today's panel is a discussion around policy, how policy gets made in DC around cybersecurity issues. We obviously want to have a engaged audience and want to take as many questions as possible from the audience. And what we'll do to kick things off is I'm going to have everybody kind of introduce themselves. I'm going to start off. I used to be the director of the National Cybersecurity Division and U.S. CERT, coming up on 3 months of being out, or 3 years of being out of government, I think this fall. So been out for a little bit now. And with a small security research group called Team Cumry. And as I mentioned, we're going to dive into particularly some of the issues around, there's been a lot of talk about cyber war and what have you. And what I'd like to do is we're going to start with Mike here in a second and work our way down the panel. But to talk about what are the priorities or what are the key issues that you see when it comes to cyber conflict or cyber war? Should we be more concerned about cyber crime versus nation state? So, and what concerns each one of you based on your vantage point? We've got a pretty diverse panel, so I think we'll have a pretty engaging conversation. So, Mike, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Great. I'm Colonel Mike Convertino. I'm the commander of what's called the 318th Information Operations Group. And our unit's responsible for essentially malware research, influence operations, and defensive posturing for the network of the Air Force. So a lot of bits and parts thrown in there. But really its focuses on effects that can be brought to bear in areas of conflict and the protection of the United States in general. So I think our biggest concern is that the foundation of the country, especially the financial system and the economic well-being of our nation's companies, the lifeblood of the existence of the company from that point of view, be protected and preserved to the extent that others want our participation. So anyway, that's me in a nutshell. Up to you.
Hi, I'm Melissa Hathaway. I led President Obama's cyberspace policy review, and I was one of the principal architects of President Bush's cybersecurity, the National Cybersecurity Initiative, CNCI. And I'm almost coming up on my 1-year anniversary of leaving the government, and for those of you following, I'm an independent and doing an awful lot of writing and speaking on the topic and trying to raise awareness in the United States and internationally on how big the problem is and what are some of the areas that we need to work on together to solve the problem.
Hi, I'm John Idonisi. I work for a company named White Canvas Group. I've been involved I'm kind of here today on the board to represent sort of the tactical manifestation of all the policy. At the strategic level, we can do policy, but there's definitely somebody that's going to be affected on the practitioner side. That's where I come in. I spent over 8 years as a Navy SEAL. I have a couple degrees in computer science, and I really try to bring the marriage of technology into operations that have impact. And I think that I have personally run into a lot of policy issues, authorities issues, cross-wiring, confusion, and I just want to sort of act as a guided voice to remember that at the end of this policy, there's a person in a place they probably don't want to be that has a family, and we need to make sure that that person can operate legally, but with the most potency at his or her disposal. And I believe in this day and age that potency and that weapon system itself has a link to the grid, to the cyber, and is largely virtual.
Morning, Rich Marshall. I'm the Director of Global Cybersecurity in the Department of Homeland Security. I've got a job that I find really fascinating and challenging, and I'll just briefly hit on some high points. Two of the main areas that we're focusing on associated with computer security is helping to make sure that developers come up with robust software that is relatively secure, at least more secure than it is. And I think some measure of success we can say that we helped influence, of course the market helped influence it as well, is that more and more of the major vendors are being a lot more careful about the software that they produce and offer. The other major concern that we have is associated with supply chain risk management. The opportunity to buy equipment, whether it's hardware or integrated circuits or software that has been produced or touched overseas, you really don't have a firm handle on who produced it, who touched it, and what undocumented features they may have introduced into that. Tom Friedman wrote a book several years ago called The Earth is Flat, or The World is Flat, and he talked about buying a computer that went through 27 companies in over 12 countries. And it's very difficult to understand what has been added to that particular product that you're buying. So that's an area that we're trying to draw focused attention to. Policy making, that is a fascinating arena, and let me give you a couple of touch points on that. Number one, policy sometimes is just a bunch of compromises, and that results in bad policy. So if you're involved in a policy group, have a leader that is courageous enough to do the right thing, not just to do the comfortable thing. Consensus is good if you're herding cats, but consensus is not necessarily good leadership. Two books I would recommend for you to read. One is by Dick Clark. I formerly worked for him when I was the Principal Deputy Director of the President's Critical Infrastructure Assurance Office. We developed a national cybersecurity strategy, which I will politely say that had it been adopted before it was overly coordinated, we probably wouldn't be having as many of the problems as we're having today. His book is Cyber Warfare, and it is an excellent read. I'm not here selling his book, so go to the library and check it out or borrow somebody else's copy, but I commend all of you to read it. It's a fascinating read. The second book I would ask you to read is by another good friend of mine, Stuart Baker. Stuart Baker has written a book called about developing policy, because he was the Undersecretary of Policy in the Department of Homeland Security for a number of years, and I'll come back to that point in a moment. But his book is entitled Ice Skating on Stilts. So the title alone can kind of give you a grasp of what it's like to formulate and announce public policy. When I was there for his book signing, when he was writing his book, he would send me various chapters to review because he was commiserating with the fact that I was coming to DHS, and I've been there 6 months and 1 week now. He said that he had been at DHS 21 years, and I said, Stu, that's impossible. You've only been there 3. And he said, well, you'll find that working in a public policy arena is measured in dog years. So I commend those 2 books to you.
Good morning, Robert Rodriguez, Jerry, and folks. Welcome. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a retired Secret Service agent, moved out to San Francisco 2001, and was tasked with building a public-private partnership initiative, bringing in the industry, government, academia community focused on cyber. To be honest with you, I didn't even know how to spell venture capital or what ROI or business culture language was. But I quickly fell in love with the spirit of the entrepreneurial community in Silicon Valley and saw an opportunity to make a difference. And since then, I've retired and rebooted. And I'm focused on giving the entrepreneurs a voice, advancing innovation through collaborative models, looking for change agents to get on the innovation train. There's a huge gap of awareness between the builder, the researcher, the investor, and the buyer, in particular between the defense industrial base and Silicon Valley, which is a metaphor I use for innovation all over the globe in Silicon Valley, but you have it in Austin, you have Chicago, Boston corridor, et cetera, and the industrial military complex that President Eisenhower warned us about. My guess is the DIB is missing about 50 to 70% of emerging growth companies. And when it comes to innovation, our nation cannot afford to leave any stone unturned when it comes to innovation, in particular in the dynamic environment of cyber.
Good morning, I'm Mark Sox. I'm a retired Army officer, and I know it says ex-NSC, I'll get to that in just a second. In 1998, I was asked by the Secretary of Defense to move from a nice cushy job at Fort Hood, Texas, where I was running computer networks, up to Washington and joined this group called the Joint Task Force for Computer Network Defense. We really didn't know what was going on in 98, and so we put together this small group to try and scope out the problem and determine how to defend Defense Department networks against this growing threat coming from foreign countries. That was in '98, and of course today we've seen what's happened with Cyber Command and many things that have come along over the past 12 years. A lot of that has been based on public policy and decisions being made strategically and at a very large level. Following September 11th, I was about to retired on a Friday, signed into the White House on a Monday morning, was asked by the President to join Richard Clark's team to develop a national strategy to secure cyberspace, to think about how do we move forward in this new world where the rules have changed. So in early 2003, that strategy was produced. That is a very big public policy document. It represents the thinking of 2002. We had a bunch of town hall meetings, and in fact, Dick Clark was even out here at Blackhat, did a talk on it during that year. But unfortunately, that document's not been updated. It is still the current standing national strategy. As Melissa pointed out, there was a policy review that was conducted last year that added to that body of knowledge, but we still don't have a strategic document that lays out a road ahead for the country at the same level as what we did. We need that. We've got to continue that talking. Mainly because things change. Technology changes, people change, the adversary changes, and we've got to keep up to date with that thinking. In latter part of 2003, I was part of the group that put together Homeland Security, created this organization that Randy's in charge of here in just a minute, the U.S. CERT. But then I left civil service at the end of '03, and I've been in the private sector since then, but continuing to work a lot of the public policy issues. Today I'm the secretary of the Communications Sector Coordinating Council, and we represent all the comms companies, Verizon, where I currently work, AT&T, Qwest, Sprint, plus the cable companies, wireless companies, and others. And we work very closely with the federal government in developing cyber policy and other types of policies for national security and emergency preparedness. What we've come to recognize is this cyber stuff is at so many levels. And in the homeland, first response, fire, police, sheriff, that world, as well as healthcare, utilities, all of that has to work, even while we're continuing to fight this big, large international cyber issue. The communications infrastructure has to work. In fact, just talking over this microphone doesn't work without some type of communications infrastructure. So at so many levels, this stuff has to work. And we've all just become accustomed to it being there. Our adversaries, of course, don't want it to work. They would like very much to deny, degrade, disrupt, destroy, the things that we heard about in this morning's keynote address. So therein lies this public and private gathering, the partnership model as we like to call it, and it is so important at a policy level that the private sector and the public sector are working together. Same sheet of music, same set of goals, same ideas. So much of the technology is the same, and many of us are moving back and forth between the public and private sector, so we're sharing the ideas. I would encourage all of you, if you've got any interest in working at this level, because we need more technology people doing policy. I'm afraid there's so few of us in the policy space that have an understanding of how it works. We get a lot of policy people, but they don't know the technologies, and we've got to get some more techie folks up. So if you want to do something different, come up to the policy side for a little while, and then you can go back to the technical side. We'll answer some more questions as we go through.
My name is Randy Vickers. I am Director of U.S. CERT. I kind of, perpetuated my career as the chief of the DoD CERT before I retired out of the Army in 2007. And Jerry Dixon and Mike Witt recruited me to come join DHS and change my uniform and fight a slightly different fight, but on the same, but in the same environment. U.S. CERT has, based on a lot of the presidential directives, the CNCI that Melissa worked on, and the other studies, the current plan to develop a national cyber incident response plan is changing the format and the structure of where U.S. CERT's going to go, and I think in a very positive way. When I joined, Mike Witt and Jerry and those guys were frantically trying to get people. When I joined, we had 8 government civilians. We now are up to almost 60, with many more in the pipeline and looking for many more. But we have this huge fight that everybody in this room, working to challenge and move through. For those that heard the keynote this morning, in that triangle of CNO, U.S. CERT is the D. We're the national D. We work with Cybercom and NSA to, as they fight the .mil networks and the national security systems and things like that. We work with critical infrastructure and key resources like the group that Marcus works with. We work with state and local governments trying to help them with the multi-state ISAC and fight their battles on the state level, as well as helping the general population and providing information so they can help secure their home networks. So it's an ever-growing and dynamic challenge as that scope expands. There are folks here at this conference that we work with at the International Watch and Warning Network, which is a international, multinational, 18-country network, as well as organizations like FIRST, and taking lessons we learn and turning them to incident response, prevention, and mitigation to help secure, our national assets.
My name is Lynn Wells. I'm with National Defense University, which is in Washington, D.C. Many people don't realize that NDU actually is a conglomeration of 5 different colleges and 20 research centers. And I'd like to talk about 2 of those in the cyber area today. One is the Center for Technology and National Security Policy, and the other is what's called iCollege, or the Information Resource Management College. So CTNSP is doing a lot of work on international and interagency policy elements of cyber issues, working primarily with the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy's office at both classified and unclassified levels. And just to indicate some of the complexities of all this, so consider a case where the United States might deploy forces. And so you're going to have requisitions and things like that that are going to be submitted through the unclassified NIPRNet networks. You're going to have command and control of those forces can be handled in classified .mil networks. If you're going to move things overseas, the State Department is going to have to negotiate clearances, country clearances, that over .gov. The FAA is going to have to handle air traffic control over some element of .gov. There's going to be a large part of .com domestically with UPS and things like that, internationally with companies like Maersk Lines. And so here you have a very important thread that runs through an important, arguably, national security interest, over which the Defense Department has only a fraction of the control. In fact, the government has only a fraction of the control. So, in fact, the United States, as a nation, only has a fraction of control. So how do you, pull together to build the public-private, whole-of-government transnational partnerships in order to promote this kind of coordination? There's also a big issue that talks about the role, for example, of DHS in domestic activities, and should NSA play such a role in supporting DHS? Well, in fact, we don't have in the country the assets to duplicate NSA in terms of crypto mathematicians and things like that. There's going to have to be some way to leverage it. So building on what Mike Hayden said this morning about finding authorities, there's a whole set of authorities called Defense Support to Civil Authorities that has not really been brought to bear very much in the cyber domain so far. And I think that's an area we're going to see some more work on. Internationally, we've been working a lot with NATO and with various allies. And it's interesting to see the very different kinds of authorities that these close allies work under. In some cases, for example, the Ministry's Defense cannot do any advanced planning on a project until it becomes a military problem. And so as long as something is kind of rocking along below some sort of an instant horizon that says this is now a military problem, the MODs aren't allowed to do a lot of the planning that we kind of take for granted. So to wrap up then with the iCollege, iCollege teaches a series of certificate courses on things like computer CIOs, CISOs, and this is world-class capabilities are being taught. In addition, they have a series of closed laboratories that can do some very interesting research. There's a SCADA lab, supervisory control and data acquisition network that's sort of blocked off from the rest of the world that you can go play with. There's a series of independent networks that you can just take commercial off-the-shelf hacking tools and see just what kind of consequences would be, particularly bringing in bureaucrats who are not used to seeing this and showing them just what can be done in fairly benign environments. And finally, the college is the head of the Federal Virtual Worlds Consortium, doing lots of work in a whole series of virtual worlds. So there's a lot of things going on related to cyber at National Defense University. A lot of it, I think, is tied. One of the nice things we can do is tie fairly closely to policymakers without being part of the sort of action officer bureaucracy per se. So I look forward to follow-on discussion.
So what I'd like to do is just get if you can raise your hand, how many of you are working for the government or are working supporting the government? Just a show of hands. Okay, so what I'd like to do is provide some context for some of the discussion we're going to dive into, especially when we start digging into cybercrime and cyber conflict, is to kind of set the stage of how policy gets made, especially as it relates to cyber. And I'd like to have Melissa kind of provide that background and how does policy get formulated? How do you bring together all the different departments and the moving parts to try to move the ball forward?
Thanks, Jerry. You'd be shocked, I think, of how policy really is made in across the executive branch. The White House convenes interagency policy committees, which are, there's 3 different types of committees that are formed. One is at let's say 3 levels down in an organization. One is 2 levels down at the deputy level. So if you saw Secretary Lute speak yesterday, that would be at the deputies level. And then there's another meeting that's at the principals level. So those people who are direct advisors to the president. And for cybersecurity, it actually sits within both Homeland and National Security Councils. And so it gets a broader swath of all of the executive branch. When there's a policy issue that needs to be discussed, it first starts at the 3 levels down at an interagency policy committee, and those people around the table debate the topic, and everybody brings their particular perspective to the table. We look for consensus, because if there really isn't consensus on the approach to take, then you need to have an arbitrator in the overall policy-making process. If there's consensus on what to do, and I'll just use perhaps an example that Rich Marshall here is working on the education initiative, and how do you start to raise national awareness and whose responsibility is that? How do you start to get to a common personnel structure within the Office of Personnel Management so that everybody's knowledge, skills, and abilities are actually measured the same way, whether you're at the Department of Commerce or the Department of Defense, et cetera. And there are a number of other areas, but we had consensus at the Interagency Policy Committee, so then it goes up to a Deputies Committee, and we present to the deputies and say this is the approach or the policy that we want to move forward to, and here's the lead, and if it has a cost associated with it, you have to address the costs associated with it as well. At the table then with costs is OMB. You usually have every constituent within the White House, which you'd be surprised. You have elements of the Vice President's Office, Office of Science and Technology Policy, and all of these different constituents. So you could have 26 different departments and agencies and actually 12 other offices that are representing of the White House campus. If there's consensus from there, you move up to the Principals Committee and along with the President, and then it becomes the policy for the executive branch that then everybody has to execute against.
I just have a quick question, Melissa. How long does it take to go from layer 3 to it's now policy?
So let me give everybody perspective on CNCI, because we didn't follow any of the rules for CNCI. And I think that that's important, because we moved at warp speed for policy and a national strategy and funding for CNCI, which most people who know that. So when CNCI, we got the tasker in April of 07. I was asked to form an interagency group to get consensus and present a strategy to the President of the United States in 6 weeks. And I convened all of the intelligence community, because at the time I was in the DNI, and we invited Department of Justice and all of those entities, Department of Homeland Security, that we did not have the purview over. We developed a strategy that was looking at the 4 different attack vectors: insider threat, proximity access, coming through the internet, and supply chain. And how does offense inform defense? We formed a strategy in 8 weeks. We presented it to the full cabinet at the end of June. And literally a week later, we got formulated into the whole interagency process. It still moved at pretty much warp speed because we briefed the president in August. He endorsed the whole strategy in September and told OMB to fund it, and it went forward as part of the president's budget in January of '08. And that 6 months, we had an entire ship movement of the entire executive branch and a fair amount of funding that was all new money, not offsets, to the executive branch. Normally, the process is very slow. And as you're actually watching right now, there hasn't been very much new policy created in the last 18 months, and because of lots of reasons. But policy normally takes 2 to 3 years to formulate, and CNCI was a very special time, and we formulated major policies across all of the executive branch in less than 6 months.
Dr. Wells?
Just if I could just note, the team that Melissa put together to pull this, and the reports that were generated across the government remain to this day to be probably the most interesting set of interagency documents I've ever read. I actually look forward to the monthly or quarterly, whatever, compendia of the work that's being done in this space, and I've just never seen anyone do it as well as she did it. It was very impressive.
So, with that said, on the regarding cyber policy, how does industry get involved in that process? I mean, what kind of input or opportunity does industry have to maybe inject their thoughts or their into that policy-making process, especially when you're on a rapid timeline like with CNCI?
I think it's critical that when policy is defined, that you bring in the practitioners, the CISOs from private industry, the entrepreneurs, emerging growth companies. Without that balance, it's hard to define a policy that is applicable and timely. And with the technology and the internet, it moves at warp speed, so technology is outpacing the policy. And one of the things that I've seen succeed in terms of bringing communities together is to identify those leaders within San Francisco or Chicago, New York, that work with the local policy folks. For example, in San Francisco, the Bay Area Council has an initiative. They brought in numerous CISOs to help evangelize and shape policy relative to 1386, which is a notification breach law. There's approximately 42 or so individual state laws, and their goal is to support a federal law, but they're doing that in conjunction with policymakers and again, the practitioners. And it's incremental. It's not boiling the ocean. It's one step at a time, and looking at deliverables that are achievable. So I think it's achievable goals, bridging that gap between the practitioners and the policymakers, and building that trust and mutual beneficial relationships within those unique communities.
Okay. Melissa or Mark, you want to touch on industry involvement in the previous process when it came to policymaking?
During the CNCI, there was not very much interface with the private sector during the development of the CNCI. There were two reasons. One, CNCI was overclassified, and two, it was very difficult just to get the executive branch pulled together in such a short time frame. I was able to take a much different approach with the cyberspace policy review, and had pushed the envelope for how the National Security Council actually interfaces, which they're not supposed to interface at all with the private sector. And I felt that we couldn't get the cyberspace policy review done without moving from a scale staff of 6 to thousands of people. And we convened meetings, over 40 meetings with industry, academia, the scientific community, and our international partners, and asked for help in key areas. And for those of you who haven't had the opportunity, the Cyberspace Policy Review is published on the White House website, but so are the 100 papers that we received from all of those different constituents are also published on the White House website. And the provenance of all of those ideas are actually footnoted in the cyberspace policy review. So everybody's footprints or fingerprints or ideas are actually pulled through that document, and we couldn't have done it without all of the help that we received from the private sector and academia and our international partners.
Let me talk about three things from a private sector perspective. Melissa's mentioned CNCI, and while the internal process inside the federal government to develop, research, and write what ultimately became the 12 points of light, or whatever we called it, once it was done, the number 12, which really impacted the private sector, the White House got through DHS with many of us, and we created an overarching name called Project 12. You might have heard that one discussed. The idea being is how can we take what we're doing in the private sector, bring that back into the federal government, and then bounce it back to the private sector for critical infrastructures. In other words, what are the best practices, the things we're doing, where there are points of light in the private sector where things are working very, very well, how do we now work with the federal government to enhance the resiliency, particularly of things like the power grid, financial services, transportation, others that are highly dependent upon cyberspace to work. So over a period of several weeks, we had in Washington face-to-face working groups to take a look at this Project 12, or the 12th part of the CNCI, and bring that forward. We worked up a set of documents that went then back to the White House as industry recommendations, which were further refined and ultimately has become public policy now for the federal government in moving forward of making that 12th objective of CNCI come to life. As Melissa mentioned, the 60-day review, which was a little over a year ago, when that first started, we already had the momentum from Project 12, so it was fairly straightforward to grab those companies that had been involved in that previous effort, plus others, and provided a private sector input to Melissa's project. This was absolutely remarkable that within a very short period of time, we were able to get from a private sector perspective, what do we know that works? How do we think the federal government should attack this, both domestically as well as internationally? And they were very open and accepting of our input that was coming in. This was very different from the way the original CNCI was done, where it was a fairly closed process with no input from the private sector at all. The third thing, which has fallen also out of CNCI, is a national response plan for cyber incidents. This is something we've called for lots of years. In fact, even back in the 03 strategy that I was part of writing at the White House early in the Bush administration, we called for this creation of something that we can think about, a framework that if the country comes under attack from a foreign agent, foreign country, or otherwise, how do we respond to it? Who's in charge? Who integrates? Who coordinates the private sector as well as the public sector's responses? Today, that response plan has been written, and it's been a joint effort between the private sector as well as the federal government. It's not perfect, as no policy documents are perfect. It's alive and working. It's gone back to the White House for their review. It's bounced back into the private sector for our review. It's gone back to the White House. So lots of good iterations. And what we're coming up with is a cohesive plan that says if the country does come under attack, or if we feel that we're being threatened, here are the appropriate roles for the president. Here's the role of DHS. Here's the role of the private sector. Here's what we do at Verizon or at AT&T or Quest or even as businesses. What are they supposed to be doing here? There's so many more things we have to work on. One of the key areas is that of how do we protect information that we want to share across these boundaries. Government information, largely classified, about the threat, about evolving real-world things. How do they share that with the private sector so we can do something about it, where I don't have cleared employees? I may be personally sitting on top of a nice security clearance and I can be read in on what's going on, but I can't swivel chair to my network operators and say, okay, here's what's happening. They're just not cleared for that information. These are things we're trying to work through. How do we take that actionable information and turn it into something that a system administrator can work on? And going the other way, if I see things in my network that will impact the running of the country or the national economy, how do I share that information legally with the federal government? Right now, we're all protected under privacy acts, so that I can't take things out of my networks and share it with the federal government. I can't legally do that unless I have a subpoena, court order, or some type of piece of paper. As a citizen, you don't want us doing that. But yet, as we move forward in this cyberspace world, this is one of these big public policy things that we're working very closely with the executive branch as well as the legislative branch and privacy groups and civil libertarian groups within the private sector to make sure we want to get this right. So this is one of those current public policy things that we're looking down the road to do that I think all this previous work has now set us up for success.
Just related to this, the issue is the definition of partnership as we try to build these public-private partnerships. A different initiative at National Defense University this year was working as a sort of trade show / demonstration type of event with a private sector company. And they wanted to list our project as a partner on the logo for the demonstration, whatever. So the lawyers came in and basically said you cannot have a partnership between a government entity and a private entity. Okay, so we took the logo off the brochure, and finally you go read the National Security Strategy. It talks about public-private partnership. You talk about the National Defense Strategy. It talks about public-private partnership. And so when I went back to the lawyers to say, you know, you're right, the law has not caught up with the policy on this one in the sense that we're interpreting this in the narrow definition of fiduciary responsibilities and things like that that go with the organization partner. But in fact, we've got to build these bridges. And so I'm actually we're actually doing a peer-reviewed paper right now that'll hopefully wind up in a law journal that basically says just how can you use the word partner and what kind of relationships can you build between the public sector and the private sector in order to facilitate the kind of collaboration I think we all recognize is essential, but we're tripping over terminology.
Okay. So what I'd like to do is put forth a couple of potential policy issues and get perspective. What I want to do is start out with Randy. U.S. CERT has a cyber incident. I shouldn't say cybercrime yet, but a cyber incident's been reported to U.S. CERT, and they're going to go through their process of handling the incident, and then they start to look at it. The initial thought is maybe it's related to cybercrime, but as you dig through it and you start to figure out, walk us through the process of trying to determine, is it a cybercrime? Is it a nation state? Is it an act of war? Is it an act of espionage? And then what are the steps that you're going to take from a U.S. CERT perspective? And then from Randy, I'd like to have Mike talk about it from a DoD perspective.
Well, first of all, let's think about trying to contextualize. We initially don't look at things because we don't do attribution. From a CERT perspective, an event, an incident, is a series of actions that cause a cause and effect. We care about the TTPs, not who's pulling the trigger, if you want to use that.
What's a TTP?
Thank you. Tactic, technique, and procedure that the adversary may be using. So that's the first challenge, is getting the information in and finding out where it's been seen before, who reported it, how it's reported. Did it come through a censor? Did it come from a department agency or a company, which we have gotten reports from a company? Did it come through other open source reporting, et cetera, or intelligence? So we take that information, connect the dots, and we start looking at what the potential impact is of that activity. Is it targeted? If you look at the recent phishing attacks as they relate to like the G20 summits and things like that, we will say, well, it might be targeted to the organizations that are participating, so the information gathered can be used at the bargaining table. And we will work with the departments and agencies that were directly affected. We will then also take that information and come up with indicators and publish that information initially to the federal government, but we will continue to share that information through the Information Sharing and Analysis Centers, the ISACs, through other fora which we participate in, to share that information to start getting it to the widest audience. Our goal is to share as much information as possible in a timely and actionable method. But with that, it takes coordination with FBI, Secret Service, NSA, Cybercom, the Intel Community Incident Response Center, the NCI-JTF, and a lot of other organizations. We will share that information, and they will connect the dots, and we will then come up with a common strategy. We will publish documents as quickly as possible without creating, the unnecessary spin that sometimes gets tied back to what could be a relatively small event. Our challenge is understanding the environment. As departments and agencies are growing and changing their infrastructure, their security posture, et cetera, understanding how an event relates back to where they sit in the process of their mission space, and being able to say it may not affect, say, Department of Energy the same way it's going to affect Department of Treasury, and being able to focus those mitigation strategies, writing signatures for the Einstein program, and then sharing those indicators again as we continue to grow that. Once that kind of formulates, then we will also continue to share with international partners. We do work with groups like, as I mentioned earlier, the IWWN and others, to be able to share information and see if it's happening. Our goal is to take information that is happening today that may be reactive to one organization or several organizations, and share the information so it's proactive and preventative to others, which, sometimes makes it a challenge of itself because of I mentioned attribution from the sense of who's doing it, but there's also that, as Marcus put it, that attribution of who the victim is. A lot of people don't want to be on the radar screen that my organization had this effect against us, whether it's from an operational security perspective or just I don't want my name in the press perspective. And so how we share what information takes a little time to compile and work, but we work with the DoD hand in hand, since what we see on federal gov or state and local or critical infrastructure networks is more than likely happening or going to happen to DoD and vice versa. So we work very closely with the National Threat and Operations Center at NSA, as well as the Joint Operations Center at Cybercom, in being able to share that information and figuring out how that goes. Our unique position is we're not a regulatory agency.
Real quick, just to...
Go ahead, coming up.
When you had that cyber incident, from a U.S. CERT perspective, you're not too concerned about whether it's an actual cyber crime or a nation-state type activity. You're going to treat them all the same from a defense perspective.
Right. So the thing is, because we're not regulatory, investigative, or intel, we let those organizations that do that make that in-depth determination. That's where that close coordination and information sharing piece comes from. The DoD defines if it's cyber war. The FBI does the counter intel, counter threat or terrorism, that kind of stuff. We just give them the indicators and the tactic, techniques, and procedures to help them understand it, and we work together, and they determine where those lanes in the road are.
Okay.
Of course, we're part of a contributor to that entire ecosystem of vulnerability assessment and analysis, really is what that comes down to. But Randy's right. We take a look at incidents in a slightly more analytical way. I mean, as we start to pull the strings and analyze what occurred, what software or whatever was injected, what it actually did, there certainly are a number of indicators that we focus on in terms of the genetics, if you will, of the exploit that was used. Have we seen something like this before? You almost get to know some of the exploiters, almost like the fingerprint of the sonic trail of a submarine in the old Cold War days, where you're tracking nuclear subs or attack subs. So you get to know who's at the other end of an exploit, not personally, obviously, but you get to know their fingerprints, how they behave, what they like to do, what code they reuse, all those sorts of things. And that's a pretty strong indicator of who actually did it. Is it legal attribution? Probably not unless a lot more research is done. And of course, we have the Air Force OSI, that is our law enforcement arm that basically coordinates with FBI and works with them when it becomes apparent that it's a crime, rather than a nation-state action. And of course, in this instance, there's a lot of discussion about our obligation to help and partner, as Lynn would say, with the defense industrial base to aid them in protection of information that falls out from the development of weapon systems and other capabilities. So yeah, we're an integral part of the ecosystem that Randy talked about. We do, as a department, have a responsibility to make as good a determination as we can as far as what the nature of the attack is. As far as the policy of dealing with it, once it's put in a cybercrime area versus a cyber warfare or nation-state action, and there's obviously many gradations of nation-state action well short of war. As far as those policy goes, that's been highly variable. It depends on the administration in charge, what's happened in the past, and sometimes even the circumstances and composition of the members of certain committees as to what we're allowed to do, and go forth from there.
Okay. So. Robert, based on your Secret Service background, say you're the criminal investigator and you're looking into this. Initially, the thought is that it is a crime, but as an investigator starts to dig into it, starts to look at other machines that might be tied to that particular criminal investigation, you start to think, okay, maybe it's a national security issue. Can you kind of walk us through that process of, what are some of the transitions and the thought processes that go into that?
Well, the agents in San Francisco, we started the Electronic Crimes Task Force, 2001, December 2001. And the whole focus there was to collaborate with the industry and government, academia, venture capital. And they quickly developed these trust-based relationships with the industry, because the industry at the time really was not calling the FBI or Secret Service. And the advent of InfraGard and these task forces allowed them to see a lot more of the criminal activity. And every once in a while, they would bleed over into potentially national security related issue or terrorism. And the difference between the FBI and Secret Service in terms of who has what responsibilities is if there has even a hint of terrorism to it, then the Federal Bureau of Investigations would take control. So we would defer that type of information to them. And over the years, we have been stovepiped. I still stay in touch with my colleagues, but the relationships are getting better. And as General Hayden said, the information sharing is continued to improve, although not perfect. So we defer to the subject matter experts on that.
Okay. So let's just say, this thing's been bubbling. U.S. CERT, law enforcement, DOD, all these different organizations have been working on this particular problem. And they're now starting to believe, okay, maybe this is related to, cyber espionage or related to a nation state. How does that information, once this is all put together, it rises through the executives and it lands at the White House? Melissa, can you kind of walk us through what happens once something like that's presented to maybe the National Security Council or whether it's the Homeland Security Council, as it bubbles up from, the agencies are starting to believe, all right, there's a lot of different moving parts, a lot of different government agencies are involved. Who kind of takes charge and helps coordinate across all the different agencies?
Well, the White House doesn't get operational. It only comes down to if there's a problem from a policy perspective or a legal perspective that the White House would get involved into a day-to-day incident. However, when there are issues that are cutting across multiple areas, the FBI or Secret Service sees one particular thing, U.S. CERT sees a second or third area, NSA sees a fourth, but they're all connected. Sometimes the only way that connecting the dots comes together is in an interagency meeting where everybody's sharing the data. That's starting to change, though, from an operational perspective as more and more of our centers are connected together and linking the data and getting to common visualization. And that was one of the most important initiatives out of the Comprehensive National Cybersecurity Initiative. And it was Initiative 5, Connect the Centers. And that was connecting U.S. CERT with the National Cyber Investigative Joint Task Force, which is where all law enforcement comes together, with the Defense Cybercrime Center and the Joint Task Force for Global Network Operations, which was DOD, and NSA's Threat Operations Center. I think I got all 6. And the National Incident Response Center, which is all the intelligence community's networks. And so as you bring those 6 centers together, you start to get to more of a common operational picture, and you get to a better warning understanding if there's incidents happening in all of these different domains. You need to be able to connect the dots. And previous to CNCI, there wasn't very much information sharing. It was more ad hoc relationship based, and now it's becoming much more formal, and there's an infrastructure around it to support that understanding.
Okay. What I'd like to do is we're going to go right down the panel, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. But I'd be interested in each one of your opinions on, if you're at the table making the decision, what would rise to the occasion of that you say, hey, you know what, this is an act of war from country X. You know, we believe that the cyber attack rises to the occasion, or you can simply say, you know, I don't think we're quite there yet. But I'd be interested in opinions right down the audience, starting with Mike for the panel.
Well, of course, being a military officer, one of the first things that we pay attention to, of course, is Geneva Convention's law of, law of armed conflict, and particularly the element that comes to mind when you say that is the business of proportionality. So we are required to respond in a proportional manner if we respond. So this idea of an overwhelming force is something that's far beyond what was done to whatever entity it might be, would not be out of the would be out of the question. We would want to respond proportionally. Having said that, I think there are many ways to respond. It doesn't always require an attack, cleared by the National Command Authority to go back, a counterattack, the idea of deterrence, to strike and counterstrike, like in the nuclear days. But rather, sometimes there's more subtle ways of defending. The release of critical algorithms critical to the defense and detection of malware, and the sandboxing of malware and those things, or the making of malware inert through these methodologies, sometimes which is closely held within our government and our confines. Perhaps that would be a course of action that we get with major antivirus vendors, and we get those sorts of things embedded in certain products, or we get them out to say U.S. companies that have been attacked. I believe that sort of thing's important, and I also think that maybe we need to have a debate short of any sort of major incident about what sorts of that kind of intellectual property that the government holds should or shouldn't be made available even now, to kind of cut down on the relative noise level on the network.
Building on Mike's comments, I think that the United States has not defined what is an act of armed aggression in cyberspace, period. And until you start to understand what is a common infrastructure and what is a sovereign infrastructure and what those thresholds may be, you will not be able to get to the discussion around warfare. I think also as you start to enter into this particular conversation, and there's been a lot of it in the United States, especially with the stand-up of Cyber Command, is that if an attack were going to be launched, it's likely going to come from a U.S. infrastructure. And if you think about all of the compromised networks and infrastructures already in the United States and how the botnets are being used, and that we are in many ways the Fatah of cybercrime already because of the way that our infrastructure is, that likely that proportionality will be against our own infrastructure. And if that's the case, then you have to rethink warfare in this overall interconnected domain.
Thanks. I think Melissa actually must have read my notes because she paved the road for me nicely. I wanted to kind of change up the form a little bit and just kind of put this out there. I believe in a totally different perspective on approaching this problem. I'll use a 30-second historical anecdote. Many of you in here were in Vietnam. I was not. And history tells us how General Giap maybe embraced a truly irregular warfare unconventional approach, similar to the Chinese game of Go, where General Westmoreland was a more traditional, conventional infantryman, brute force type engagement. I find myself in Fallujah a couple years ago. We have tanks rolling down these little tiny alleyways, and I have people that are shooting at me in civilian clothes from buildings that I can't find. Eerily similar. So I think as we look at this problem, not just in terms of response, and I am moving to answer the question, I think our perspective needs to take into consideration that we're in an environment where there is no definition of boundary, of identity, of responsibility, of accountability. And I think that in the case of the Fallujah example I gave, I think our .mils and our .govs is the tank going down the alley, and I think our .coms is everybody else. And I think when we build a policy or strategy, if we're gonna have to build a castle, because we will, around those things that stick out, like a .mil or a .gov, then we need to prepare to fortify that, but we also need to give appreciation to ambiguity, give appreciation to not being obvious. I think that not only has that helped us, and I know from, I regularly work with Special Operations Command and some other entities, I know that that is how we do operations, and that has given us a lot of success. General McChrystal really put the road forward in doing this, and we've seen a lot of response in the physical execution of those strategies, and I think we could see some similar gains in the cyberspace. So as we consider policy and as we consider authorities, consider another perspective, that perspective of not J-damming servers, but maybe, as Mike said, maybe it's a more deliberate strategy. Maybe it's sort of a reputation denigration. Maybe it's inducing uncertainty into the cyber lexicon, much like they did with To Catch a Child Predator, where people don't even feel comfortable organizing inside cyber. So, kind of a long answer. My response, well, if that were to occur, hopefully by then, there would be sort of digital version of SETI, or citizen soldiers that could, in their free time, participate, crowdsource. I do agree with Melissa. I think we would have to, based on the level of attack that we received, would in some regards shape our response in scope. But I think a lot of things that need to be considered is the prevention of such attack. And I know we didn't talk about deterrence much, but I think a different perspective from our government would afford us major leverage on the deterrence side, so that people may think less of going after those castles and coming after our infrastructure.
I'm going to be the curmudgeon at large here, which is my comfortable role. We have three choices. We can make things happen, we can watch things happen, and we can wonder what happened. So I'm going to issue a policy challenge to you. Let's don't get distracted by the 1,000 points of illumination, because they don't put much light onto the subject. Sometimes we overanalyze, and in the process of overanalyzing, we get wound around the axle and we don't make any progress. Let's make our systems more resilient and less likely, or less attractive to be exploited by an adversary. And one of the best ways to do that, and I'm inviting you to participate in a policy formulation. This is a live exercise. Get involved. The American public spends more money on astrology than the American government spends on basic R&D for cybersecurity. We need to change that. We need to change that. Because if we don't, reading a horoscope is not going to give you much of a future. Now, some of the paths you can go, write your members of Congress, send them emails, tell them you want more money spent on research and development for cybersecurity. Encourage small cap companies. Help create an environment where a small cap company, a small capitalized company, can develop cutting edge technology. The leading edge technology is not always developed in the large corporations. It's in someone's garage or backyard or basement. Help make a change in that particular area, and it will make a difference. Now, I say this for a couple of reasons. One, part of my areas of responsibility is research and innovation. And one of the individuals that I deal very closely with is Doug Maughan, who's in our S&T area in the Department of Homeland Security. And together, one of the individuals that we deal very closely with is Robert Rodriguez, the gentleman that is sitting to my right. He has been an ardent and very persuasive spokesperson all across the country to encourage research and development and to make it more attractive for U.S. money to be invested in U.S. companies to help change some of this tide. Now, I'm not saying this as, a bout of nationalism, because we're all interconnected with the internet. That's the beauty of it. It's a long logistics train. The technology may have been developed by the Western world, but it's being exploited by our adversaries. I'm going to give you a rough analogy, and it's a very rough analogy. The Romans built an infrastructure that consisted of the Appian Way, roads, and also aqueducts to bring water into their cities. As long as they protected those assets, either with their own individuals or with trusted second parties, their civilization remained. But when they let those logistic lines of communication deteriorate, it opened the pathway for the Franks, the Gauls, the Vandals, and the Hun. And these are not rock groups on a world tour. But they marched in, they exploited the technology that Rome developed to bring down Rome. We can't afford to have that happen in our lifetime. Don't think just of yourselves, but think of the legacy that you can leave your grandchildren. You want them to live in a better world than we currently live in. You can make a difference.
Okay, Robert, back to the topic on if you're advising a policymaker, what would you advise them? What would you consider an act of war or not? We heard about a couple of great options in whether it's irregular operations or special operations. What's your perspective on it?
First, I want to thank Rich for his most eloquent remarks. He's always a challenge to follow after. Thank you for your comments. Very kind of you. I want to touch on Melissa's point there, definition of war. It is very hard to define what war is when we really can't and don't understand the internet. If we truly understood the internet, we'd be able to protect it better. Recently, Admiral McConnell made some comments about what he believed was defined as war, cyber warfare. And Howard Schmidt had a different opinion. So there's opinions on what constitutes war. To me personally, it's society, it's societal impact, it's the level of disruption to our infrastructure, the economic impact, loss of life, very, very serious, obvious serious matters. And with the internet, it's non-kinetic, but then can be turned into kinetic type tragedies. So let's say that they were able to open the floodgates of a large dam and then loss of life occurs. Warfare, you always need to have deterrence, right? In the Cold War, we knew exactly where and who would launch a nuclear weapon. In cyber, we can't positively and accurately and timely identify where that attack may come from. Attribution is very, very difficult. Most of the offensive weapons, the capabilities are defined and built by the Defense Industrial Base, but I advocate that the entrepreneurs in America that are building for defensive posture have great opportunities and potential capabilities to help our government as we move forward in warfare, which quite frankly will take place over the internet and not have to send bodies in when you can disable satellites and ships and tanks and communications, etc. And then going back to, is it John? Yep. Asymmetrical versus brute force, right? The adversaries are asymmetrical. They move at warp speed. They don't have the corporate governance, policy, privacy, budget, and sometimes egos of challenges that government does. They don't have the bureaucracy and the hierarchy, the morals, ethics, legal, etc. And they have one or two objectives. It's financial gain or intellectual property, industrial espionage. And then again, what is warfare? Net warfare versus cyber warfare. How do you define that? You know, the exploitation, damage of data that affects us, and how severe. This is going to be a very difficult challenge. At what point is it actually warfare?
Just want to add 30 seconds.
I yield 30 seconds.
Okay, thank you. So in past conflicts, we'll pull the carrier, an aircraft carrier off a country's coast as a form of increasing pressure. What is analogous to that in the virtual world?
So essentially gunboat policy, but in the cyber realm.
So, Mr. President, you asked me to give you policy advice on warfare on the internet. The biggest problem we face is one of analogies, and I think we're all guilty of this. Cyberspace is so new, everybody wants to describe it in something we're comfortable in, something usually related to the physical world, and that same problem can be applied to the use of the word warfare in cyberspace. We were falling back on all these analogies, you know, gunboat warfare, and I'm not throwing any darts here, but just work with me on this. Warfare in general is the last step of a series of diplomatic actions taken between countries who are trying to resolve some type of dispute, be it over land or values or beliefs or something. You try and work it out diplomatically and various things. If that doesn't work, ultimately warfare is what you get to. We can see this over thousands of years of human civilization. How does that work in cyberspace? How do we do diplomacy in cyberspace? What are the other steps that we've already taken to work out some type of dispute, some conflict between countries in cyberspace where the last action that we take, the final act, is warfare? And can we map what we know in the physical world over into the cyber world using all these different analogies that we have? And I don't think we can do that yet. We still don't understand how to do diplomacy in cyberspace. We don't know how to do bilateral talks, multilateral agreements. We don't have, a United Nations or a NATO or something of cyberspace. We don't have that common understanding yet. And to make it worse, if we want to really apply that analogy, look at the Constitution of the United States with the amendments. The Second Amendment allows each citizen the right, or provides the right, to keep and bear arms. How does that apply in cyberspace? If we start fighting, if we make cyberspace a place where we conduct war, well, what's the right of an individual citizen? Do you have a right now to fight in cyberspace? Can you keep and bear arms? Can you defend yourself as a citizen? And what are your responsibilities as the owner of private property in cyberspace? What if your private property is invaded by somebody else? Do you have the responsibility to close the doors, to put up protective measures to keep things from coming into your private property? And if you fail there, are you liable for this? Take the physical analogy of a swimming pool. You have a pool in your backyard, you fail to put a fence around it, some kid falls in, you can be held criminally liable for creating this attractive nuisance that the kid fell in. You put your computer online, you fail to patch it, you fail to do all the firewalling and all that, can you be held criminally liable for creating an attractive nuisance, something that could be used as a weapon against another country? So this analogy stuff, we have to be very, very careful. We start talking about warfare in cyberspace, we've got to be ready to carry this all the way through. All the other civil liberties that we have, rights, responsibilities, things that have been laid out, all have to apply. We can't just carve out and say, oh, we'll call this warfare, but we're not going to talk about the rest of this stuff. That's the mindset the President of the United States has to have. That's the mindset we all have to have. This is very serious stuff, and it's not just pick and choose a few names and a few analogies and munge them together and say, okay, this is how we're going to do it. So no, Mr. President, we're not ready yet to talk about cyber warfare. That conversation still needs to be developed.
Well, that's a very difficult act to follow because the points that Mark and Melissa and others have stated are quite evident that we are not ready. Internationally, countries can't define warfare. They'll define it differently. We can't define how to manage intellectual property, so we definitely can't figure out how to manage this thing that somebody wants to call war an attack. Is it trespassing? The other thing that we can't articulate and why we can't say it's an act of war is when you conduct that type of activity, you have an expected outcome, an expected battle damage assessment, you have expectations. You can't do that in cyber because that IP address may be sitting in domestic space, could be sitting in that protected space like a hospital or other things, even overseas. So to be able to execute those activities, you got to have a level of knowledge that you can pinpoint to the exact location what you're going to do, what's going to happen, and what the impact is to that greater community. And then now you get into the political aspects and the retribution of that and what happens. So we are a long ways away from understanding that definition and then how to define the outcome and the battle damage assessment of such activities and what the political ramifications are for that. So no, we are not ready.
So my sense has always been that we should be interested in is mission assurance, not information assurance or whatever. I don't believe in our professional lifetimes we're going to get to a definition of war that all of us are going to be comfortable with. We haven't declared war since 1941 in this country in kinetic, much less in cyber. On the other hand, mission assurance basically says we have a set of objectives we want to accomplish. We need to accomplish those irrespective of the level of attack, threat, whatever we're under, whatever you call it. And to me, that's a mix of preparations and resilience taking into account velocity. So the preparations are, going back to the resilience, what have we done ahead of time to get our people ready to understand what's happening, to make our networks more resilient. And this is not going to be a 100%, all of a sudden, zero. There's going to be some degradation of capability that at some point is going to come back. So how do you prepare and make that bathtub as narrow as possible and as shallow as possible? But then there's another part of preparation that General Hayden alluded to this morning. It's the role of CNE. I mean, they're presumably, and obviously we can't talk very much about the specifics of this, presumably there are people out there on our side who know something about what's happening. And how do you bring that to bear? So, and then how do you put together a set of rules of engagement that people can respond? Because the last part of this is the time. This is not, if you have to convene the interagency committee plus the deputies committee plus the principals committee and take it to the president, forget it, you've lost. This is happening in sort of machine time in many cases. So how do we restructure our processes to take into account that reality?
So essentially what y'all just witnessed is what would happen in, say, a policy coordinating committee. You had different stakeholders and different views and vantage points dealing with a particular issue. In this case, we were evaluating cyber war. And as you see, it's a very complex problem. There's never an easy answer. There's a lot of different moving parts that come into play. And so I've only got, I believe, 5 minutes? So we only probably got time for 1 or 2 questions. So here's your chance. There's a microphone right over here to ask a question.
The question I have is, I hear a lot of talk about taking the physical aspects out of cyber warfare, and I don't quite understand that. The easiest way I can explain that, I guess, is looking over at your question on the board, and you wanted to know if anyone would be willing to confess to any federal crimes. I will.
Come see us.
I've dropped road apples to government employees that had of infected USB drives and committed mail fraud. I've broken into a government agency. I've busted into, social engineered my way into most of our financial institutions. Granted, I did that legal under very specific contracts. There's a physical component to cyber warfare. Whether it's blowing up an electric grid in a particular region in the United States that are going to affect our cyberspace, whether it's physically breaking into a government agency in order to get at data or install wireless access points and try to obtain access to a government agency's network. Why do we keep trying to take the physical aspect of it out? You're correct that there are no boundaries.
Not all of us do. So, I mean, physical security does go hand in hand, certainly, with.
Well, I just remember General Hayden this morning saying, is there that transference of the physical aspects that can be applied to cyber warfare? Absolutely. I don't even know why it's a question.
So part of the issue is the analogy of taking a physical of the 4 domains that General Hayden mentioned and making those analogous to cyber versus the impact of a cyber event. The things you described are more in lines to, yes, there is an impact to the grid. There is a physicalness to the impact of an execution of some type of activity. But to say, comparing it to, it's like the muzzle flash of the sniper sitting here, to say that's where I can target my activity, that is where the difficulty of taking the physicalness out of cyber. But saying it's, there is no physical impact, no, I don't believe anybody has said that.
And so real quick, why not just say warfare? Why say cyber warfare? Why not just say warfare?
Yeah,
It is. That's why I'm saying I don't understand the distinction between the two. Cyber warfare versus warfare, it's all warfare. And, you know, the gentleman from US CERT, you guys provide us guidance and information on vulnerabilities and exploits. Why aren't we seeing physical? Why aren't we trying to map out and tie all of the pieces together so that we can try to recognize patterns, so when we can see physical security breaches and tie those to, or attempt to tie those to cyber breaches? Maybe there's a correlation there, I don't know. But until we can try and correlate all of those events, I think we're going to have a struggle in defining this space and what the boundaries are.
Just in the aspect of time, so law enforcement handles a lot of is the physical component of that, and part of our relationship with the law enforcement community, you know, we deal with that. Sometimes it's organizational, it's not even law enforcement. So having a physical breach is up to a independent, each individual organization to work with law enforcement and others, and sometimes that type of information doesn't get conveyed because it's a slightly different lane in the road.
Right, and Randy, that's at the low end. At the high end, he's right. You blow up, you know, you bomb a telephone exchange. Oh yeah, that's a form element of cyber warfare. Yeah, I'm looking right at you, Marcus.
Yeah, I know you are.
I just think we have to be careful about not getting so wrapped up around the term warfare that we lose track of the fact we need effective responses at whatever definition we're at. And those responses are almost certainly going to have to be a public-private combination in this world.
Right, but conflict's probably better.
We've got time for one more question, and then we've got to wrap up. If you got questions afterwards, feel free to come up and talk to specific panel members.
Because I'm not currently admitting to any federal crimes, I'll identify myself. I'm Joe Mann with the Financial Times, and this question is for Marcus and Melissa and anybody else who wants to jump in. But I'm looking also for reaction to Hayden's comments on a couple things. One was this the sort of geographic, the likelihood of, they're both about the likelihood of developing international consensus that's meaningful on both sort of responsibility for actors within your geography, and then for these norms that would include banning DDoS and protecting financial and power networks. Is any of that remotely feasible, and in what kind of time frame?
Just a brief answer. I've been part of those CFR discussions, Council on Foreign Relations, and yeah, I think we can do things there. But this isn't something we do this week, next week, or this year. It's going to be a multi-year process. But the best part is that we are now having the ability to talk about it. A lot of this previously was locked up, couldn't discuss it, classified. Those doors have been unlocked. And that allows now the general public, not just US citizens, but citizens of other countries to get involved in this. We need that thinking. We need the perceptions of what other nations, other ethics, other mindsets, so we can synthesize an international understanding of what are these new rules. And again, we won't do that this year, but at least now we're moving forward, which is good news.
I think there are two events that have happened in the last 2 months that suggest that there's the beginning of international dialogue. And first was the UN government group of experts, where 15 nations agreed that we needed to talk about this and get to common definitions. And the second, which might be more important, was in mid-May, the NATO group of experts report published their advice on the NATO strategic concept review, which is basically NATO 2020, and highlighted cybersecurity as one of the top 8 priorities, where if there was an event similar to an Estonia event, it would require mutual assistance, and it would actually call upon Article 5 of an attack upon one is an attack upon all. And that will then now have to open up what is an act of armed aggression in cyberspace and what is proportionality in a whole, and what is a combatant in cyberspace and a non-combatant. And all of those issues will have to be addressed now by NATO and most of Europe.
Thank you.
I also think that the sky is not all dark clouds. I think there's a lot of good that can come to dialogue internationally with people that have backgrounds in any sort of technical industry that touches the internet. And you saw this in Haiti. I mean, you saw code being jammed up. You saw dev tools being deployed to help the people in earthquake-stricken areas. You saw the same thing in Banda Aceh and some other areas. And you've seen on sites like Patients Like Me, run by Jamie Haywood, where patients that have the same ailments have come up with 1,200 cures for medical conditions doctors didn't even know about, all because they could talk to each other, regardless of race, language, culture, etc. So in addition to kind of echo what Melissa said on the other side of the house, I think we have a huge opportunity to sit down and have the dialogue, and I think the very system that we're talking about is the best venue to do that.
All right, well, I want to thank the panel, and thank you all for attending. Thank you.